Have you ever wondered what happened to the Nazis after their defeat in World War II?
What happens is that there are so many people who've made their peace with the Nazi regime.
Beyond the well-known trials and tribulations, a series of less talked about, yet equally fascinating events unfolded. From secretive evacuations to desperate destructions.
I remember the shock. Yes, but this explosion of hatred, it was so overdramatic.
Let's delve into the shadowy aftermath of a regime's collapse. Ready for a journey into the lesser-known corridors of history? Number 1. Evacuation to Obersalzberg. As the Third Reich crumbled, a frantic effort to evacuate crucial files and personnel was set in motion. The destination? Obersalzberg, a mountain retreat in the Bavarian Alps, once a place of leisure, now a haven for the remnants of a defeated regime. This operation was not just a simple relocation. It was a desperate bid to preserve the core of Nazi ideology and secrets. Picture this: trucks loaded with documents, artifacts, and the most trusted staff, winding up the mountain roads under the looming threat of Allied forces. Among these were personal correspondences, state documents, and perhaps the most intriguing architectural plans, reflective of Hitler's grandiose and now unattainable visions. The evacuation wasn't merely a physical movement of resources. It symbolized the last gasp of a regime trying to hold onto its shattered identity. As these trucks ascended, the air was thick not just with the mountain chill, but with a sense of an ending, a historical chapter closing abruptly. Yet, there's an irony here. In their haste to preserve, the Nazis were also sowing the seeds of their own mythology, a narrative that historians would later painstakingly piece together. What secrets did these mountains hold? And what became of these relics of a fallen empire? The answers lay hidden, nestled in the alpine sanctuary of Obersalzberg. Number 2. Destruction in Munich. Meanwhile, in Munich, a different kind of preservation was taking place, one that involved flames rather than files. Julius Schalby, an SS officer, was entrusted with a mission critical to the Nazi narrative: the destruction of sensitive and personal materials in one of Hitler's apartments. Imagine, in the heart of Munich, as the city braced for the imminent Allied arrival, Schalby and a trusted driver were burning documents, photographs, and personal letters. Among these were likely correspondences that could have shed light on Hitler's personal life, perhaps even his relationships and innermost thoughts. Why destroy these artifacts? It was a bid to control history, to prevent the Allies from uncovering materials that could further tarnish the already dark legacy of the Nazi leadership. This act of destruction was as symbolic as it was practical. In burning these materials, the Nazis were attempting to erase traces of their humanity, their vulnerabilities, aspects of their lives they wanted forever shrouded in mystery. But as the smoke rose from the burning piles, it signaled not just the physical destruction of materials, but also the disintegration of the carefully curated image the Nazis had built. Each ash that fluttered away was a piece of a narrative they desperately wanted to control, now lost to the winds of history. This moment in Munich was not just about destruction. It was a final, futile effort to shape a legacy that was already spiraling beyond their control. Number 3. The arrest of Hermann Göring. In the chaotic aftermath of the Nazi defeat, a dramatic turn of events unfolded with the arrest of Hermann Göring. Picture this. Once among the most powerful men in Nazi Germany, a figure of immense influence and fear, now cornered by the very regime he helped build. But here's a twist. His arrest wasn't at the hands of the Allies, but under suspicion of betrayal by Martin Bormann, a fellow, high-ranking Nazi. Why? Göring had sent a telegram to Hitler, proposing to take over leadership of the Reich, a move perceived as high treason. Göring's arrest is a stark portrayal of how quickly the tables turned within the Nazi hierarchy. Imagine the scene. Göring, surrounded by his own, realizing that the power he wielded was now his downfall. This moment wasn't just an arrest, it was a symbol of the disintegration of the Nazi power structure. As Göring was taken into custody, it was as if the once impenetrable Nazi facade was crumbling. This man, who had flown high on the wings of Nazi power, was now plummeting down, caught in the web of suspicion and paranoia that the regime itself had woven. The arrest also signified the fracturing of loyalties within the Nazi elite. In their final days, it wasn't just the Allied forces they feared, but each other. Göring's fall from grace was a clear indicator that the Nazi leadership was not a united front, but a collection of ambitious individuals, ready to turn on one another when the end seemed near. His arrest, therefore, wasn't just the capture of a man. It was the embodiment of a regime eating itself from within, a final act of self-destruction. Number 4. Bombing of Obersalzberg. The bombing of Obersalzberg by the British Royal Air Force was a pivotal moment in the final chapter of the Third Reich. This wasn't just any bombing, it was a targeted assault on the heart of the Nazi retreat. Obersalzberg, once a place of rest and strategic planning for Hitler and his inner circle, transformed into a symbol of Nazi extravagance and ambition. And then came the bombs. As the RAF planes soared over the Bavarian Alps, their targets were clear: the buildings and headquarters that had housed the architects of some of the most heinous crimes in history. The bombing was more than a military operation. It was a statement, a declaration by the Allies of their dominance and the inevitability of Nazi defeat. Imagine the thunderous roars, the buildings shaking, and the Nazi edifices, once symbols of power, now crumbling under the weight of explosives. But there's a deeper significance to this bombing. It wasn't just about destroying buildings, it was about dismantling a legacy. Each bomb that dropped on Obersalzberg was not only shattering concrete and steel, but also the myths and grandeur that the Nazis had built around themselves. This act was a physical manifestation of the Allies' resolve to not just defeat a regime, but to obliterate the very foundations it stood on. In the smoke and rubble of Obersalzberg, one could see the end of an era. The place that had witnessed strategic discussions, leisurely stays, and key decisions in the war now lay in ruins, a testament to the downfall of a regime that had once seemed invincible. The bombing of Obersalzberg, therefore, was not just a military victory. It was a powerful symbol of the disintegration of the Nazi Empire, a resounding echo that reverberated through the annals of history. Number 5. Preservation and destruction of documents. In the twilight of the Third Reich, a paradoxical effort to both preserve and destroy documents was underway. This wasn't a mere administrative task, it was a race against time and history itself. On one hand, key Nazi officials were fervently preserving documents that they believed could be their legacy or bargaining chips in the post-war world. On the other, sensitive materials that could incriminate or reveal too much about the inner workings and failures of the regime were being destroyed. Imagine the scene. In dimly lit rooms, officials sifted through piles of paper, making life and death decisions about each document. This process was a complex dance between preserving their version of history and obliterating their mistakes and horrors. Among these papers were personal letters from Hitler's half-niece, Gaily Raubal, possibly shedding light on the private side of a dictator, and architectural plans, dreams of a world that would never come to be. This dichotomy of preservation and destruction was emblematic of the Nazi regime's final days. As they teetered on the brink of collapse, their actions were driven by a mix of denial, desperation, and a diluted sense of historical significance. Each decision to save or burn a document was a reflection of their fractured psyche, torn between wanting to be remembered and feared being judged by history. These documents, whether preserved in secret vaults or turned to ashes, became silent witnesses to the end of an era. They held stories, secrets, and strategies, encapsulating the twisted ambitions and fears of a regime that had once dreamt of ruling the world. This episode of preservation and destruction wasn't just about documents. It was a final, futile attempt to control a narrative that was already slipping away into the hands of history. Number 6. The birth amidst chaos. In a poignant contrast to the destruction and desperation, a moment of new life emerged amid the chaos. The birth of Albert Bormann's child. Albert, brother of Martin Bormann and part of the Nazi inner circle, found himself in a surreal situation. As the Third Reich crumbled around him, his wife was in labor, about to bring a new life into a world that was drastically changing. The birth, taking place during the evacuation to Obersalzberg, was more than a personal event for the Bormann family. It symbolized the bizarre juxtaposition of life and death, hope and despair that characterized the end of the war. Here was a family, deeply entrenched in a regime responsible for unimaginable atrocities, experiencing a moment of pure human emotion, the joy and fear of childbirth. Imagine the scene. Amidst the rush to evacuate, amidst the sound of distant bombings and the palpable fear of impending defeat, a baby's cry pierced the air. This moment of birth was a stark reminder of the continuum of life, even in times of unprecedented turmoil. It was as if the universe was asserting that even in the darkest of times, life finds a way. However, this birth also raised questions about the future of those born into the remnants of the Nazi regime. What legacy would this child inherit? Would they carry the burden of their family's past? Or could they forge a different path in a world that was trying to heal from the scars left by their forebears? The birth of Albert Bormann's child, amidst the chaos of the Nazi downfall, was a powerful metaphor for the complexity of life and history. It was a reminder that even in the midst of destruction, life continues, often bringing with it the promise of new beginnings and the challenge of reconciling with the past. Number 7. Looting in Obersalzberg. As news of Hitler's death rippled through the airwaves, Obersalzberg, once a secluded haven for the Nazi elite, became a free-for-all zone. The local populace, long suppressed under the Nazi regime, saw an opportunity in the power vacuum. The grandiose buildings, including Hitler's Berghof residence and other Nazi guest houses, stood as symbols of excess and oppression, now vulnerable to the wrath and curiosity of the locals. Envision the scene, crowds descending upon these properties, driven by a mix of resentment, curiosity, and opportunism. The looting was more than an act of theft. It was a cathartic release for a population that had endured years of fear and hardship. As they ransacked rooms, uncovering opulent furnishings and personal items, it was as if they were reclaiming a piece of their dignity, stripping the once feared leaders of their aura of invincibility. The looting also revealed the stark contrast between the lavish lifestyles of the Nazi leaders and the suffering of the common people. Every piece of cutlery, every piece of art or furniture taken from these residences was a testament to the disparity and the delusion of the Nazi ideology. But perhaps more importantly, it marked a symbolic reclaiming of power by the ordinary people, a tangible overturning of the Nazi regime's dominance. Number 8. The fate of Eva Braun's dog. In the midst of the turmoil and transformation of post-war Germany, a seemingly trivial yet touching story emerged. The fate of Eva Braun's Scottish Terrier, Negus. Left behind in the chaos, Negus's story is a poignant reminder of the personal and the mundane amidst historical upheaval. This dog, once a companion in the highest echelons of the Nazi hierarchy, became a stray, wandering the ruins of a shattered regime. Negus's abandonment speaks volumes about the final days of the Nazi leaders. As they fled, faced with the reality of defeat, even the most loyal of companions were left to fend for themselves. Negus, in his abandonment, became a symbol of the crumbling Nazi regime, once powerful and feared, now scattered and forgotten. But there's more to Negus's story than just abandonment. It reflects the disarray and desperation of those final days, where even the smallest aspects of life were thrown into turmoil. Imagine this dog, accustomed to the comforts and security of Eva Braun's side, now alone, navigating a world turned upside down. Negus's journey from a pet in the lap of luxury to a stray is a small yet poignant reflection of the larger narrative of downfall and disarray. Negus's fate also captures the human side of history, the small personal stories that often get lost in the grand sweep of events. While the focus remains on the leaders and the major events, it's these small, almost anecdotal stories that offer a more relatable, humane view of history. Negus, in his own way, becomes a character in the narrative of the Nazi downfall, representing the overlooked and the peripheral, yet somehow adding depth and color to our understanding of these monumental events. Number 9. Final arrangements and escapes. As the Third Reich crumbled, the final arrangements and escapes of key Nazi figures unfolded like a dark drama. Picture high-ranking officials and their families, once powerful and feared, now scrambling in panic and desperation. Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary, and others, including Hitler's secretaries, were among those making frantic plans to evade the approaching Allies. The urgency and chaos of these escapes were not just about self-preservation. They were a stark reminder of the sudden reversal of fortunes. Yesterday's rulers were today's fugitives, seeking refuge in various locations, from remote villages to foreign countries. The meticulous planning and covert routes they used underscored the gravity of their situation. Capture or death were imminent. But there's an irony here. The very individuals who had orchestrated mass violence and terror were now consumed by fear and uncertainty. The elaborate escape plans, often involving fake identities and secret paths, were a far cry from their former lives of command and control. Their fates were no longer in their hands. They were at the mercy of a rapidly changing world. These final arrangements and escapes weren't just about physical movement. They were symbolic of the disintegration of the Nazi regime. The once unassailable leaders were reduced to shadows, desperately clinging to the remnants of their shattered lives. Their journeys, fraught with danger and uncertainty, were a microcosm of the larger collapse of the regime they had served. Number 10. Destruction of Nazi bunkers and possessions. In a final, defiant act, the Nazis set about destroying their bunkers and Eva Braun's possessions. This destruction was more than a tactical move. It was a symbolic gesture, a refusal to let these remnants fall into enemy hands. The bunkers, once impenetrable fortresses, were now being systematically demolished, their secrets buried under rubble. As the walls of these underground havens crumbled, it signified the literal and figurative collapse of the Nazi stronghold. Each explosion was a death knell for the dreams and delusions that had been harbored within these concrete depths. The destruction was a final, futile attempt to erase the evidence of their crimes and their existence. Eva Braun's possessions, too, were part of this purge. Personal items, possibly including diaries, clothing, and photographs, were burned or destroyed. These were not just objects, they were intimate parts of a life entwined with one of history's most notorious figures. In destroying them, the Nazis were not only trying to prevent their capture by the Allies, but also erasing traces of a private world they wanted to remain hidden. This deliberate obliteration of bunkers and possessions was a last act of defiance, a refusal to leave behind anything that could be used against them or tarnish their legacy. But in their eagerness to destroy, they inadvertently revealed their vulnerabilities and their desperation. The flames that consumed Eva Braun's belongings and the dust from the collapsing bunkers were the final desperate gasps of a dying regime, a regime that, even in its death throes, sought to control its narrative and its place in history. Number 11. Art in salt mines. As the Nazi regime faced its inevitable downfall, a clandestine operation to safeguard their looted art collections unfolded. Deep beneath the Earth's surface in the salt mines near Salzburg, an extraordinary array of art and valuables found a temporary refuge. This was not just a simple act of storage. It was a desperate attempt to preserve the spoils of a war that had ravaged Europe's cultural heritage. Envision these salt mines, transformed into surreal galleries of some of the world's most priceless artworks. Paintings, sculptures, and exquisite pieces of jewelry, all amassed through years of plunder, were carefully stowed away in the labyrinthine tunnels. The Nazis, known for their voracious appetite for art, had amassed a collection that was as impressive as it was ill-gotten. But why salt mines? The answer lies in their unique environment, providing the perfect conditions for preserving these treasures. Cool, dry, and most importantly, hidden from the Allied forces' prying eyes. These mines were the last stand for the Nazis' looted legacy. The art stashed away in these mines was more than a collection. It was a testament to the grandiose and twisted ambitions of the Third Reich. However, this endeavor also highlighted the Nazis' delusion. In their minds, these artworks were to adorn the museums and galleries of a victorious Reich. Instead, they became symbols of their greed and cultural barbarism. The salt mines, with their hidden troves, became a metaphor for the Nazi regime itself, a facade of grandeur concealing the dark, hollow core within. Number 12. Capture and fate of Nazi officials. As the war ended, the capture and fate of Nazi officials unfolded as a gripping aftermath of the fallen regime. From high-ranking officers to Hitler's close aides, many found themselves on the run, their destinies uncertain in a rapidly changing world. This wasn't just a manhunt, it was a moral reckoning, a bid to bring those responsible for unimaginable atrocities to justice. The Allied forces were relentless in their pursuit. Names like Albert Bormann, Julius Schalby, and Hitler's secretaries, once synonymous with power and terror, were now on videos of the most wanted. Some officials were apprehended swiftly, facing imprisonment and trials. Others, however, slipped through the cracks, adopting new identities and living in obscurity, haunted by their past. Each capture was a story in itself, a small victory in the larger battle against the remnants of the Nazi ideology. These captures weren't just about retribution, they were symbolic of a world trying to make sense of the horrors it had witnessed. The trials and imprisonments that followed were as much about delivering justice as they were about documenting and understanding the depths of Nazi crimes. But the fate of these officials varied. Some, like Albert Bormann, lived in hiding until their eventual capture or voluntary surrender. Others faced trials and were sentenced for their crimes. A few, however, managed to evade capture for years, leading lives that were shadows of their former glory. Number 13. Evacuation to Hintersee. As the Third Reich's end neared, a less dramatic but equally telling episode unfolded: the evacuation of Nazi families to Hintersee. Nestled in the picturesque Bavarian Alps, the Pensionhof in Hintersee became a sanctuary for those closely associated with Hitler, including secretaries and families of high-ranking officers. This evacuation paints a human, almost mundane picture amidst the larger narrative of war and defeat. The journey to Hintersee was a stark contrast to the lives these families had known. Gone were the days of power and privilege. Instead, they faced uncertainty and fear. Imagine the irony. The very individuals who once enjoyed the spoils of power were now seeking refuge in a modest pension, their futures as unclear as the war's outcome. Hintersee's tranquil setting belied the turmoil these families were experiencing. Here, they awaited news of the war, the fates of their loved ones, and the impending arrival of Allied forces. The Pensionhof, with its serene backdrop, became a temporary bubble, shielding them from the chaos engulfing much of Europe. This evacuation to Hintersee wasn't just about physical safety. It was also about preserving a semblance of normalcy in a world that was falling apart. For the children and spouses of Nazi officials, Hintersee offered a brief respite, a moment of calm before they faced the consequences of their association with the regime. This chapter in the story of the Third Reich's collapse reminds us that behind the scenes of monumental historical events are individuals grappling with the immediate realities of survival and uncertainty. Number 14. Interrogation and arrest by U.S. counterintelligence. In the aftermath of the war, the U.S. Counterintelligence Corps undertook a crucial mission: the aggressive interrogation and arrest of individuals associated with Hitler and the Nazi regime. This operation was not just about punishing the guilty, it was a vital part of understanding and dismantling the Nazi network. The counterintelligence teams were relentless in their pursuit. They tracked down secretaries, relatives of high-ranking officials, and anyone linked to the Nazi leadership. These interrogations were intense and thorough, reflecting the Allies' determination to root out every remnant of the regime. The information gathered was crucial in piecing together the inner workings of the Nazi machinery and in preparing for the Nuremberg trials. The arrest of these individuals marked a significant shift. The very people who once wielded power and instilled fear were now powerless, facing their captors' questions. The interrogations shed light on the complexities of the Nazi regime, revealing not just the mechanisms of power, but also the human frailties and moral ambiguities that characterized its members. But this wasn't merely a quest for information. It was also a moral undertaking. By holding these individuals accountable, the U.S. Counterintelligence Corps was sending a clear message: that the world would not tolerate the atrocities committed under the Nazi regime. These arrests and interrogations were as much about justice as they were about healing and setting a precedent for international conduct. Number 15. Life post-war for Nazi affiliates. In the shadow of the war's end, the lives of those once closely associated with Hitler and the Nazi regime entered a new, uncharted phase. Figures like Christa Schroeder and Joanna Wolff, once main secretaries to Hitler, faced a reality starkly different from their days in the echelons of power. Their post-war lives offer a glimpse into the complex fates of lesser-known Nazi affiliates. After enduring arrest and detention, often for several years, these individuals were eventually released into a world that had drastically changed. The transition was challenging, to say the least. They had to navigate a society that was both recovering from the trauma of war and grappling with the revelations of the Holocaust. For many, this meant living under the heavy burden of their past, often in anonymity, trying to blend into a society that had been deeply scarred by the regime they served. Some, like Schroeder and Wolff, chose to share their experiences through writing, offering a unique perspective on life within Hitler's inner circle. Their accounts, while controversial, contributed to the broader narrative of the war, providing insights into the personal dimensions of the Third Reich.